I think one of the things we're working on as wives is to get out of that parenting role, which is an easy one to be in, meaning we find things to be critical about. We have lots of great ideas about how to make your life better and what you should be doing to be safe. And every time we step into that role and try to control that, we step into that parenting role. And I often describe it to my clients. It's kind of like we're up here as a parent, and the one receiving all of this information feels like a child, and we have this hierarchy in more or less in our relationship. I think what we all know we long for is this equality, this partnering in our relationship. And one of the first things a wife can do is to get out of that extraordinary planning for her husband's recovery.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We're here today with Deb Laaser, the co-founder of Faithful and True, and probably our favorite guest because
we don't like to have favorites.
No, but she made me say that. We're happy to, as always, to have Deb with us today, and a couple of great questions as we continue this series that we introduced a couple of podcasts ago about questions. So we have been having team members of Faithful and True come to the podcast and bring with them some very, very thought-provoking questions. And Deb, you brought a great question with you today.
Yeah, I did. Shall I introduce it? Or
Yeah,
you?
Why not, since it's your
that'll
question?
That'll be different rather than our usual director of the podcast. Well, I have been working with a wife, and I know one of the questions that has come up is that her husband believes that his job is to help build trust with her, and therefore she is the one that should determine what he can and can't do. Mm-hmm. And she feels uncomfortable with that. Obviously, we believe differently about that. And so we wanted to talk about what really is helpful, who should be, I don't like the word should, what's most helpful in terms of who's determining the boundaries someone wants to live by in order to find sobriety in their life. And
also kind of like who is responsible for the recovery plan itself. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of mixed messages out there. Sometimes we are told that we're supposed to take care of our spouse, and so whatever our spouse wants us to do, we're going to do that to serve them. Others would say that the spouse has no role in the recovery plan, and that basically the person in recovery does it just for him or herself, and the spouse is just a passive observer. And what we would say is it's probably in the middle, this idea that ultimately the person struggling with the addiction, in this case it would be the man, is responsible for his recovery plan, and he supports his wife in this by sharing it with her, including her in it, and she is not responsible for it. We often talk about this idea of the difference between external motivation and internal motivation. And in this particular case, if I am only motivated by something outside of me telling me that I need to be in recovery, we know that that's not going to be a sustainable recovery. But if I want this for myself, then I'm going to be proactive and take responsibility for myself, and then I can include my spouse in that, and my spouse won't be responsible for it.
And I think it's important to remember that there's no one right way or no one list of things somebody needs to do to create their own plan, because everybody's acting out is perhaps somewhat different, and what is in what we call their yellow circle, or what creates temptation for them, can be different. And so that's why it needs to be a unique plan for them. Mm-hmm. And we'll take some time to really work through, ideally with a counselor, to get very specific about what those things are going to be.
Right, and because everybody's story is unique, to a certain extent, their strategy is going to be unique. And what triggers a spouse may be unique to that particular spouse because of her relationship with her husband or her own story. And so in that particular case, there may be things that I need to be aware of as the husband struggling with addiction, and I can be informed by my spouse for things that might be triggering, something that might be helpful for her, but ultimately I'm still responsible for implementing in that plan and using our language. If I'm a wise man, then I'm serving my wife. If I'm in my survivor man, then I'm placating my wife. And if I'm in my little boy, I'm trying to appease and make my wife/mom happy. And we know the energy of survivor man and little boy are not going to be sustainable for recovery. So there is a complexity to this as couples try to figure out how to have a conversation about it.
Yeah, and as therapists and pastors try to help couples too, because I think one of the things we're working on as wives is to get out of that parenting role, which is an easy one to be in, meaning we find things to be critical about. We have lots of great ideas about how to make your life better and what you should be doing to be safe. And every time we step into that role and try to control that, we step into that parenting role. And I often describe it to my clients. It's kind of like we're up here as a parent, and the one receiving all of this information feels like a child, and we have this hierarchy in more or less in our relationship. I think what we all know we long for is this equality, this partnering in our relationship. And one of the first things a wife can do is to get out of that extraordinary planning for her husband's recovery.
And you know what complicates it is, as someone struggling with addiction, I'm not seeing clearly. You know, that's part of the chaos, is I've not been able to see clearly. I don't see myself. I don't see circumstances clearly. And so it is common sometimes that a spouse can see something that the husband cannot see. And so it's maybe tempting for a spouse to be over controlling or over directive with what they understand. And I would say for the spouse, for the husband struggling with addiction, it's important to listen to your spouse. Even if you're having reactions to what they're saying, they may actually be able to see something that you're not able to see for yourself.
And Deb, a minute ago, you referenced the yellow circle.
Yes.
And that might be confusing to one of our viewers or listeners. Tell us about the three circles.
Well, maybe I'll default to you.
Because the
to
three
teach
circles
that.
plan is one of the things that we teach at the men's workshop. We've done other podcasts about it. It's something that a lot of the addiction and recovery communities use. And basically, if you imagine a bullseye where there's a center circle, then there's another circle around that, and then a third circle. And so in that middle circle, that center circle, there is what we are wanting to avoid. It's however we define sobriety. And for us, we're defining it as no masturbation, no adultery, no lying, no pornography. And we put it in order of lamp, no lying, no adultery, no masturbation, no pornography. And so as somebody in recovery, I'm wanting to avoid that center circle. And then around that is what we refer to as the yellow circle. And the yellow circle are those things that are not necessarily acting out, but they bring energy to me that are going to move me towards the acting out. And that can be triggers, and that can be vulnerabilities. That can be unique behaviors that if I consistently do those behaviors, it's going to move me towards the red circle, that center circle that I'm wanting to avoid. And then on the outer circle is the green circle. And those are the things that bring us life. That those are the good things that either I haven't been doing much of, or I haven't been doing well, or I haven't been doing at all. That I know if I'm nurturing my soul, if I'm taking care of myself. It can be things that are self-care. It can be relational things that are life-giving. If I'm active in the green circle, what's going to end up happening is it's going to keep me from moving toward that center circle and wanting my addiction. And so we talk about the three-circle plan, and that's one of the ways that we encourage men to talk about their recovery plan with someone else, whether it's their group, their sponsor, their therapist, or their spouse.
And that is, as you said earlier, Greg, maybe one of the differences in what we believe is helpful to a couple's development is that is shared with a spouse. And I know in many of the 12-step groups, this is your recovery. You don't need to share this kind of thing with your spouse. I think as Christians, we believe that's one of the ways we create emotional intimacy and safety and reduce anxiety for one another. And we do believe that's helpful. Now, there is a caveat to that, which is a wife who gets overly controlling once she has that information. And I think that's why in many programs they resist doing that. They know as soon as they mention, I think I'm going to not watch any kind of R-rated TV anymore. And all of a sudden, the wife's controlling the controller, and she's asking all kinds of questions about what he's looked at. And by the way, even though this was an R, it had this in it. Did you turn away from that? And it just becomes too much of a controlling situation. I worked with a wife once that 5 years after disclosure and sobriety on his part, she was still putting parental controls on his television watching. We don't like that kind of controlling. We don't believe that contributes to emotional intimacy in a coupleship. And again, that's more from this parenting place to a little child.
Right.
So there's this fine balance between knowing information and being able to let go of controlling information. And I think that's our job as wives, is to figure out how to do that with help.
And part of it too, Deb, is you've kind of alluded. So what would be a spouse's response when the husband has clearly said, these are some things in my yellow circle, I'm going to choose to avoid those, and then the wife becomes aware that there are things in that yellow circle that he's not avoiding. So we know that we don't want control, but what would be a healthy response for a spouse in that particular case?
Well, learning how to have healthy responses is all about what we're about in terms of developing healthier communication with couples and for yourself. And so I'm going to recommend that a wife is going to start with talking about what she's feeling, what she's thinking, and what she's needing. It's kind of simple, and it's part of our iceberg model, which I know you're going to ask me what that is. 'Cause you may not know. Stay tuned. It'll be part of a podcast coming up.
I'm only here to prod.
I know. But all that to say, I mean, she might say, I'm worried. I noticed that you were watching things the other night that I know you mentioned you didn't want to. And the story in my head is that if you do a lot of that, you might fall back into some of your old patterns. And the other story is if you were to do that, I just don't know how long, that I can tolerate that. It's just not what I want for our marriage. My need is for you to take seriously some of the boundaries you set up for yourselves, maybe get whatever help you need in order to remove those, because that was a place of real safety for me too.
And what I would also say is, if, let's say that a man's been in recovery for a while and originally there was something that he wasn't going to do, but at this point he feels like it's safe to bring in, that instead of just doing that on his own, that he has an open conversation with his wife about that, to be able to say, you know what, this is something I'm rethinking, this is how I plan to approach it, these are the people that I've included in this conversation, this is how I'm getting support. And I'm just going to test the waters, and if I discover that I can't do this or it's not safe, then I'm going to be able to make a decision to choose not to do that anymore. So instead of just a slow fade or an unintentional evolution, there's a very purposefulness to it and a very specific conversation so that the spouse is aware that the husband is thinking through what the recovery plan should be. And instead of it just changing without her awareness, she's included in the conversation and she's not driving the conversation.
So this could become a real stuck point for our couples, couldn't it? Because what if I'm a wife sitting over here saying, I don't like that. Makes me really nervous. I just don't think you should be doing that. And he believes he's ready to do that, and they are definitely at different places. So how would you respond to that?
Well, one of the things we believe is sometimes couples need help navigating specific conversations, and if it's a conversation that regularly creates triggers and chaos, to get some support to be able to do that. But also, like you said earlier, it's helpful to move it beyond the behavior for both persons. So the wife is able to talk about what's getting triggered in her, whether it's anger, anxiety, fear, and the husband is also to talk about what's going on for him. What are his core beliefs in this particular situation? What are his perceptions? What are his feelings about what's going on? And the temptation is to focus all the energy on the behavior, either stopping the behavior or doing the behavior, and we're missing out on those deeper issues that are really, in many ways, driving the behavior. And so, for the man, maybe he wants to see if he has the confidence to try something new in his recovery, or he lives in fear that he will always have to stay in these limitations. And to be able to acknowledge that, to talk to the spouse about that, and let her know his ongoing continued commitment to recovery. And what may be true is because of some choices that he's made, she doesn't really trust his ongoing commitment to recovery. And that may also be something that needs to be talked about.
Yes, and I think that's where, as female counselors here working with many wives or partners of addicts, we do try to help her deal with whatever anxiety is coming up because maybe she doesn't have her way, so to speak. And I think ultimately we're trying to accept the fact that we are individual adults, and ideally we need to be in our wise person places, making the right choices for ourselves, serving our spouse when we can, and accepting that sometimes we won't always agree on everything. If it doesn't become a bottom line for a wife, for instance, for a new behavior a husband wants to try, I think then it's a challenge to work on what do I do with my anxiety, or if I don't feel safe about that, or do I need some lessons in knowing that he doesn't need as many controls and he can still be a sober man. And wouldn't that be freeing to know that? So sometimes our desire to control so many things is still about hoping that you will never fall into this issue of unfaithfulness again. But we won't know where you are in that journey if we don't let go of some of the things we're trying to control and let life be lived.
Well, it's interesting. There's a couple that I work with that they're really stuck. They just are. And there's an entrenchment around these bottom lines. And there is basically a bottom line request that the wife has that she is unwilling to move on. And there is this strong resistance on the husband's part to acquiesce to that bottom line. And it really is a challenging place to be. As an observer, I can see that for both of them, it's about fear. It's her fear that he's not going to validate or affirm the pain that he has caused her. The fear that maybe he will fall back into the old stuff. And it's almost like her desire is for him to get it. And it's become about this bottom line. If he will do this, then that means he's gotten it. And for him, it's about not wanting to be dictated to or told what to do. And I find it challenging to even know how to navigate that, to support them in how they navigate it. Because once we become entrenched in something, and it almost goes from being a bottom line to be a defining situation, it is difficult to know how to navigate it.
And that's why I think individual help is really necessary. It's hard to work on in couples. I know I talk sometimes about it. At what time is a wife perhaps in a little bit more of a revenge place, believing what she needs for safety or what she needs for him to do or not do is going to be almost an entitlement of hers because of what he's done. We need to be careful of that place, I believe. Again, if our long-term goal is to develop a healthy relationship where we're emotionally, spiritually connected, I think we're going to have to look at places where we still need somebody else to do something or be something for us to be okay. And I know we talked about that in some of our prior podcasts, even about safety, for instance. Can we expect that we won't agree on everything in our life? And can we learn to let go of some of that? And maybe that's where we trust God, too, in this process, that He is overseeing us as a couple. And He knows what we want. And maybe if we could let go of some of that, we could practice what it means, too, to depend on Him to step in and help in areas where a spouse may not feel like they need something or they disagree with what we need. I think it's a great spiritual step for many of us. And by the way, this is not in month 1 or 6.
Right.
We're talking further down the line here,
Well, and I also think just an openness, let's go back to that idea of if a couple finds himself in this entrenched place, to be open to asking the question, what causes this to be so important to me? Am I willing to look at that? And by asking that question, in no way are you minimizing the importance. You're actually validating the importance, and you're simply wanting to understand, is there some additional energy that I'm bringing to this, some unresolved places in our marriage that predate me finding out about the addiction, or early on in our marriage where there's some experiences that are now being brought into this particular circumstance. And so being able to explore with a safe person, with my therapist in an individual appointment, while I see myself entrenched, can I begin to explore that to understand what's moving me to that place?
Yeah. And that's where we long for couples to go into greater depth in their own stories. It could be that some wives are exposed to a lot more unsafe environments in their growing up days, or brothers or dads or even moms who struggled with addictive issues, sexual addictive issues, which has created an extra whole layer of anxiety and fear about that. It could be for either one of them that they've been told so much about how to live their life and given so much advice that they can't hear anything from the other person. And so we need to look at what some of those patterns were so that we know we're not bringing all of that energy, as you say, into the current situation where we feel so stuck.
And I think another factor that we run into is we do have those situations where a wife would say legitimately that she was really unaware that this was going on. Mm-hmm. And I think in those situations, one of the challenges is, in hindsight, the wife can begin to see some things maybe that she missed, but there can be a pledge going forward that I'm not going to miss anything again. Mm-hmm. And then that creates that over-focused on, it's kind of sifting through everything to see if there's something that needs to be acknowledged or known about that. And just that hypervigilance that comes from the experience itself, I think it's helpful for a husband to be able to say, it makes sense that you are hypervigilant. It makes sense that because of my level of deception, you're afraid of missing something. And I want to do what I can to serve you in that space, not placate you from the survivor man, but serve you from the wise man place.
Mm-hmm. I just want to say that one of the things I loved about the fact that Mark had the opportunity to go to inpatient treatment is they had a lot of time to work on these kinds of things, exploring what the boundaries needed to be, what that yellow circle was about, where were the temptations coming from, and what kind of roadblocks did we need to put up for, what did he need to do for himself so as not to be overwhelmed by this sexually saturated world. When he came home from treatment and he was able to clearly share that plan with me, it felt very safe for me to know that he had many things in place that he wasn't going to do. Some of them were hard, like not going to the beach or places where, people didn't have much on. And I love the beach. And so in some ways, I struggled too with knowing I wouldn't have him to go there, or we'd have to figure out other vacations. So sometimes there's sacrifices in terms of how we do life that we need to be willing to look at also. But all that to say, I think what we want to look for is a wife who seems to be overly engaged about her great ideas for what he needs to do. To me, is often a symptom of a husband who hasn't done enough of that work. Mm-hmm. And if he's tired of her great ideas, one of the things I think he can do is to think about whether he has a big enough plan for himself. I know it's introduced at the workshop here. There isn't a lot of time to spend developing that. And I think many men go home and maybe depending on who they're working with, they don't go on to finish that plan. Mm-hmm. But in that case, when a good plan is established, and if there's an additional need a wife might have or two or so, I think it's a lot easier, hopefully, for him to hear that. I remember having an additional need myself when we were traveling or we were at conferences, and Mark was clearly interacting with other women, and I didn't know who they were. I know I asked if he would please introduce me and as quickly as possible tell me who they are, what the connection was about. He didn't think about that as being any problem for him. It was just for me. Mm-hmm. And so he began to do that, which, served me in that place. And it was very helpful for me to have more information when we were out and about.
Well, and you talked about, we've kind of dropped it in earlier, but I think it's worth revisiting that idea of the external motivation versus the internal motivation. And so if a man approaches his 3-circle plan and his belief is, I'm doing this for other people, I'm doing this because my wife needs for me to do this, or I'm doing this because my small group leader asked me to, or my sponsor, or whatever, the energy is just completely different. But if a guy is able to say, no, I'm doing this because I want this for myself. I want to become the man that God created me to be. And if I really develop this plan and live the plan, then I'm going to be moving in that direction. And what's true is most of us who are married, there is some part of our recovery energy is about saving our marriage, is about wanting to please our wife. And for those of us that are codependent, it's about wanting our wives to be happy so that we can be safe. So nobody's going to be able to do it totally pure. But the clearer we can be about what our motivations are, and the more it's revealed to us that we are doing it for other people, not for ourselves, when we come to that awareness, then we do what we need to do to recalibrate so that it's not somebody else's three-circle plan given to us either directly or indirectly. It's our three-circle plan, and we are choosing it for ourselves.
And anytime you do that, anytime any of us are internally motivated, we move ourselves out of this child place and into our adult place. And then we can connect adult to adult with our spouse. So very helpful for someone to want this for themselves and to see it from that perspective. We all long to be grown-ups in our relationships, taking responsibility for our own choices and our own behaviors, and that hopefully most of the time they're healthy ones, and that we can serve people out of that, and we can also know what our needs are so that we can serve ourselves.
Absolutely.
Great point to end on.
Yeah,
right there,
absolutely.
that was, you guys wrapped
Okay.
that up beautifully. Deb, thanks so much for being with us again today. It's always a
Love it.
joy to have you on the podcast. And Greg, as always, masterful job of hosting. And so we hope that today's show for you has been beneficial. And check our podcast library, because as Greg made reference to earlier, there were some earlier podcasts in which the three circles are discussed as well. If you are a man that's out there struggling with sexual addiction or unwanted sexual behaviors, we encourage you to take a look at faithfulandtrue.com, click on the workshops, and there's lots of information. We offer our Men's Journey workshop every month, and we invite you to get involved, to register, to come and join us. We also have the Women's Journey workshop and the Couples Journey workshop that we do 3 to 4 times a year. Information and registration are all available on our website. So until we join you again next time, we thank you, and we hope that this coming week for you is a week that's filled with many blessings and great vision.